My name is Chris Savage. I am the chair of the Washtenaw County Democratic Party. We are the one of the co-organizers of this group, of this event, along with the Liberal Leadership League. From the Washtenaw County Dems, we have Janet Cannon, Teresa Reed, and myself. From the Liberal Leadership League, we have Brian Watson, Lisa Dorado, and Michelle Pallas. And then We Make the Future, we have Eli Day. I'd like to thank all of them. And then Liz Brown, who is Anat's assistant, also helped considerably in getting this put together. We're here today because, people talk about how Democrats don't get their message out. And I'd say that we get our message out, but frequently we get the wrong message out. And learning to communicate properly is such an essential part of it. And going into this crucial election, here in Michigan, it's an utter turmoil, but it's similar everywhere. It's really important that we are effective in our communications going into the primary and then the general election, so that we are motivating our base and persuading the middle folks and pissing off our opponents. And so that's what we're here today to talk about. We are going to, when I finish with when Eli finishes the introduction, we'll move on to Anat's presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A after that, and then we'll have a couple of success stories to talk about, and then we'll close out. If you have a problem of any kind, there's a Q&A button at the bottom. Please put your questions there. That's better than putting it in the chat where it might get hidden by quickly by other chats. So please do utilize that Q&A function. And we hope that when you come out of this tonight, you will be in a better position to communicate properly going into these crucial elections, because we don't have the luxury of not winning this time. Our democracy is at stake. I'd like to thank our promotional partners, all of whom help promote this event. The People Michigan, Demcast Michigan, Eaton County Democratic Party, the Huron Valley Area Labor Federation, AFL-CIO, Lenawee County Dems, the Livingston County Dems, the Michigan Democratic Party Rural Caucus, the Michigan People's Campaign, Protectors of Equality in Government, or otherwise known as PEG, Rust Belt Rising, and Statewide Indivisible Michigan, also known as SWIM. And I'd also like to thank in advance Brian Greminger, who is in the audience here tonight, and he will be processing the video after this. There will be a video after this, and we'll have more details at the end of the program, but for those who want to share this later, we'll have it available. I think that's about it. Anat, I want to thank you so much for being here. This whole thing started, at least from my perspective, with us having you on our podcast, the GOTMFB show, a few times, and then you're gracious enough to come out and do a fundraiser with us and promote, or elucidate people or educate people on your stuff, and that really caught fire here, especially in the mid-Michigan area. And so that event really triggered a lot of the subsequent things that we've done around the race class narrative, and super excited to see it getting picked up literally globally now. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eli, and he's going to do the introduction.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. What's up, everybody? Very happy to be hanging out with y'all tonight. I'll be real brief with the introduction. Firstly, my name's Eli from We the People Michigan, and We Make Michigan, which I'll say a little bit more about later. Anat Shenker-Osorio is the principal and founder of ASO Communications. She is also the host of the must-listen podcast, Words to Win By. Anat examines why certain messages falter where others deliver. She's led research for new messaging on issues ranging from freedom to join together in union to clean energy, and from immigrant rights to reform and criminal justice. Anat's original approach through priming experiments, task-based testing, and online dial surveys has led to progressive electoral and policy victories across the globe. Anat delivers her findings, as you'll see, and as I've very happily and delightfully endured several times in presentations that are packed with snark and delight and good humor. And she's done this at venues ranging from the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Center for Australian Progress, Irish Migrant Center, Open Society Foundations, Ford Foundation, and Lush International. Her writing and research has been featured in a bunch of spots: New York Times, The Atlantic, Boston Globe, Salon, The Guardian, Grist, among others. And she is also the author of Don't Buy It, The Trouble with Talking Nonsense About the Economy. And just lastly, I want to shout out how immensely important and helpful Anat has been for helping organizations like mine, We the People Michigan, stand up and establish brands like We Make Michigan in states across the country, so that we can more effectively and more forcefully deliver potent messaging that not only overcomes the divide and conquer tactics of our opposition, but also delivers people a compelling alternative, a vision of a different future that they can be a part of and join and help deliver. And so with that, I think I will bounce it to who's next in the run of show. Sorry.
Anat is up.
Okay, yeah, right. That's the intro.
Thank you, Eli. You're very, very, very kind. I'm going to start up the presentation in a second, but I just really want to express how much there is no messaging without organizing. Messaging is in service of organizing. And it's all of you folks. It's everybody who is talking and not talking on this Zoom that actually gets the work done. That's where the work happens. And so I'm just incredibly grateful to all of you for all that you do, for, you know, making this happen at 6:12 on a Wednesday. I am in California, so it's still arguably my work day, whereas y'all should be knocking off and, I don't know, having some beers, but instead you're hanging out to talk about this. And that's just a testament to how, who you are. So thank you. And I'm going to walk us through a whirlwind tour of some principles of persuasion and mobilization, and then hopefully we will have a robust conversation. So I call this presentation How to Make Believe, and that's a very deliberately chosen title. You might guess that everything that I say is very deliberately chosen because basically people pay me to tell them that words mean things. So words mean a lot to me. And by make believe, I want to be clear that I mean both on the side of what's typically known as persuasion, that is the wooing and luring of the all essential swing voter who apparently lives, eats, breathes in some Midwestern diner. I'm guessing you've all seen him because Michigan is part of the Midwest. And of course, we're supposed to be very, very concerned about him. And yes, they said him deliberately. But I also, in terms of how to make believe, am referencing mobilization, because that is also an act of making people believe that their civic engagement, their voting, their volunteering, their texting, their phone baking, their faith in a political process that, let's face it, has oftentimes let them down, is worth doing anew. And I also call this How to Make Believe because it is rooted, when it is effective, in stories. It is rooted in once upon a time. And I'll come back to that over and over again. So I'm going to walk us through a set of principles, the first of which is say what you're for. If you forget everything else that I say today, and you can only remember one thing, which is totally justifiable because we're still in this pandemic and none of us, or maybe I'm projecting, can remember a goddamn thing. So you can only remember one, then just remember, say what you're for, say what you're for, say what you're for. That is the first principle for a reason.
Clearly, humanity is central to this, and that's something that everyone can get on board. Players are saying, I may not be the aggrieved group directly. I still see you as my brother, and I'm standing by you.
We have to present people a compelling and understandable story of what it is we want, what it is we believe, and what it is we are going to achieve when and not if we win. That ad, by the way, part of the very successful slate of ads that we ran across the Midwest, including in Michigan in 2020, that proved themselves both in-channel testing prior to being aired and in field testing in persuasion and mobilization. But all too often, we are a no and a don't and a stop and a can't. We are an unending litany of what we should not do. In its most simple form, this is classic negation. Recently, my parents are not child abusers. CRT is not taught in our K-12 schools. Immigrants are not taking our jobs. Muslims are not terrorists, which, as I'm sure all of you know, but yet it still keeps happening, just calls to mind that very fact in the negation. But more broadly, we also engage in negation by offering people a series of unrelenting negative demands. End this, stop that, don't do this, can't have that. The issue with being on the side of negative demands is that it robs us of airtime to say what we are for, to present to people this desirable case for the world, what that would feel like, smell like, taste like, if and when we actually are victorious. I know that it can feel, believe me, I know that it can feel, I feel this frequently, like there is no affirmative demand to make, given all of the realities of what we confront in this country. But I can assure you that if you dig deep enough, there always is one. And I challenge you to figure that out.
You are my sunshine, my only sunshine.
Tú me alegras es así.
You never know, dear, how much I love you.
Nunca quitas mi cielo de mí.
The other night, dear, as I lay sleeping,
I dreamt I held you in my arms.
al despertarme no te tenía. Escondí mi cabeza y lloré. Please don't take my sunshine away.
I've tested it many times, and we can create a fair immigration process relative to end deportation, stop family separation, don't do this, stop that, can't have this. It always tests better. We also need to remember that when we make negative demands, we render ourselves a potential victim of our own success. When, for example, during the Trump administration, advocates rightly called to, quote, end family separation, the Trump administration began detaining everyone together and said, I did what you asked. I'm no longer separating families. What is it you're upset about now? We have to remember that an argument that is rooted in sympathy, essentially some version of, we need to feel sorry for those people, is still a form of othering. Anytime we are attempting to make a case by the demonstration of what I call harms and horrors messaging, we are engaged in othering. What we see is actually effective is building a bridge to empathy. This is an example from work in Australia where I used to work frequently pre-pandemic. 2013, prior to doing the research and implementation of the new messaging, seeking asylum is not illegal. Learn the facts and show your support today. Classic negation. Obviously, the reason why the government of Australia was shunting people to offshore prisons is because they didn't know the facts. That was a joke. 2015, right before we had done the research, classic harms and horrors messaging, child behind bars, the only developed country in the world that locks up children seeking asylum. This is in fact no longer true. Australia no longer does this. The US does, as you rightly probably know, to where they pivoted after the research was completed by the end of 2015. Here we see Amir at the time of this photo actually in a prison camp where they shunt people and have had for the last 35, 40 years of Australian history, saying, I want to be a human rights lawyer. There are people on this planet you can help by doing simple things. Amir is in a prison camp in this photo, but it doesn't look like that. And the affirmative demand, bring them here. Not end this, not stop that, but actually a forthright exhortation to bring them here. The advocates, the human rights community in Australia won this campaign. They won Let Them Stay. They won Kids Off Nauru, and they won the Medevac bill. 4 sequential campaigns over the course of a single year of 2016, evacuating 2/3 of these prison camps, which, as I told you, had been operating for more than a generation. Again, I understand it can feel like there is no affirmative demand to make. There is no story that would garner empathy instead of attempting to get people to feel sorry for, quote, those people. But I challenge you to recognize that there always is. Fair warning, this ad begins with very low sound. So if you're wondering about that, the sound will kick in, I promise. Again, another in the slate of ads that we aired in our 2020 cycle across the Midwest. A basic premise, I would argue, of good messaging is that we shouldn't force people to perform their pain for us as a condition of accepting their humanity. And because I conduct, whenever possible, participatory research, meaning that embedded within every stage, especially the early data gathering intel stages, is work with the affected community. That is why I adhere to this principle of not parading people's pain before them. Because what we find is that in the case, for example, in Australia of people seeking asylum, or in the case of the United States of the unrelenting police violence against Black and brown folks, having to witness that over and over and over again is traumatic for those communities. Essentially, part of what effective messaging does is, in marketing parlance, it creates an overlap of brand identity between whatever it is you are trying to convince people of. In marketing terms, it would be the product that you're selling, and the target audience. You are trying to somehow find the area where the thing that you're promoting, let's say a comprehensive immigration reform or a fair process or reform of policing and an overhaul of the criminal legal system, you're trying to find the spot in the story where that overlaps with what your target audience feels about themselves, wishes to feel about themselves, wants to believe about the world, the stories that they want to hold, or the stories that have been with them for a very long time. We can do this across issues, no matter how contentious.
Someone you love may struggle with a pregnancy.
Thank you.
A pregnancy they longed for that slipped away. Someone they were counting down the days to meet that couldn't survive. A pregnancy that would endanger providing for the children they already have. A pregnancy they were too sick to carry, that they never planned to have, that wasn't right for them, that comes too soon after giving birth, that would mean starting over. Someone you love might need an abortion someday. You can help ensure that when the day comes, they can get the care they need.
I support you.
So say what you're for. Principle 2, order matters. What we find in testing is that the exact same set of 3 sentences with the order shuffled around actually makes a measurable difference in terms of both persuasion and mobilization. So I'm going to show you an ad that is in the correct order, and then we will walk through what that order is. So that ad is really not that different to the I don't know how many hundreds of different COVID ads that aired in the 2020 cycle, as you likely know. But the fundamental distinction is that rather than begin with the presentation of how horrible everything was and everything that the Trump administration was doing to botch the response, it begins with an affirmation of people standing with and for each other. So this is the order. It is values, then villain, then vision. So it is not that we don't talk about our problems, we don't talk about the bad stuff that's going on. We do. We just don't use that as our opening salvo. Boy, have I got a problem for you is not an especially effective hello for most people, because most people got 99 problems and they are not out looking for yours. And so we want to first lead with, again, what we're for. And in the case of the ad that I just showed you, actually demonstrating, look, we do care for us. Here are everyday Americans caring for each other, doing the right thing, providing aid, providing masks, doing their jobs, etc. Because that is what makes the second statement, the introduction of the villain, actually land that much more noxious and that much more potent. Because at that point, it is both a harm to the particular community that's affected, and it's an abrogation of that shared value. What we find in testing is that if we lead in directly with problem, with villain, it's not that people don't believe us, they do. It's that it is nearly impossible to move them from the unleashing of that negativity to the requisite hope, belief, desire for action. Because what we have done is we have given rise to their completely understandable cynicism. And again, what we often find is that our opposition is not the opposition, it's cynicism. It's not that people don't think our ideas are right, it's that they don't think our ideas are possible. And so that is a significant barrier that we need to overcome. We need to recall that in any election, even though we don't have a parliamentary system, there's actually always three candidates running. There's our person, their person, and stay at home. And stay at home has the home team advantage because people are already home. We have to actually get people to go out and do a thing.
Our money could go here, or it could go here. Our money could go here, or it could go here. Just imagine where our money could go if corporations paid what they owe instead of taking it for themselves. Tell your state representatives to demand corporations pay what they owe.
This is part of a slate of new ads that we've created for state-based revenue fights. Again, another formulation of that contrast, in this case, a back and a forth and a back and a forth, but still presenting that contrast. Number 3, sell the brownie, not the recipe. Many of you have heard me say this. Repetition is important, so I'm going to say it again. As you can see, the picture on the front of this box is, of course, a picture of a brownie. But as you all well know, when you open up this box, sadly, there is no brownie inside of it. I know that I'm not spoiling this for any of you. We are familiar that it is a bag full of powder. And on the back of the box is a series of steps that you must undertake in order to turn said powder into said brownie. We need to stop selling the recipe and start selling the brownie. Instead of talking about the process, the set of steps, we actually need to talk about what those set of steps, what our policies will deliver, and make that imageable for people so that they can sense how it would actually feel to have, let's say, universal single-payer healthcare. Instead of just taking our policy out in public, which is ineffective and unseemly, instead we can say to them, anytime someone you love is ill or injured, they can get the care they need without fearing they'll go bankrupt to do it. You need to sell the outcome of the policy, again, from the new-ish revenue work.
Is your town suffering from a lack of progress? Are projects and social services all backed up? It's time to try revenue. With annual doses of revenue, communities can thrive in no time. Side effects may include a profound sense of justice, decreased corporate money hoarding, billionaire sad face, and jobs. Ask your state representatives if revenue is right for your community, because it is, and corporations need to pay what they owe.
Need to sell what revenue buys you. Number 4, a lesson I am guessing all of you know well, which is that politics isn't solitaire. So what I mean by that is that unfortunately, we do not exist in a situation in which people only hear from us. If that were the case, I don't think we'd be here on a Wednesday night. We would be doing something more fun. Although what is more fun than watching ads and talking and nerding out about messaging? Nothing, right? We need to recognize the fact that people are hearing relentlessly, constantly, and with an incredible amount of message discipline and repetition from our opposition. And so what do they hear from that opposition? Well, again, as is familiar to you, basically an unending torrent of some form of race baiting, fear mongering, and scapegoating with a different cast of characters every time. Sometimes it is, quote, law and order. Sometimes it is about immigrants. More recently, it is about trans youth. It's about CRT. It's about policing. It's about whatever they come up with in the moment to divide and distract us. It is their core narrative, and they're not going to stop with it. So what is it made out of? It is made out of stoking racial fears. Those fears can be economic, the magical immigrant who is both taking your job and not working. Whoa! Those fears can be existential. They're not coming in the right way. They don't believe in our way of life. And while the effect of those fears is to create enmity against Black and brown people, other people of color, trans folks, women in certain situations, just depends, wherever they move their little C and say, whoever they decided is going to be most effective to scapegoat in that moment. The core purpose of it is actually to undermine the sense that there can be a collective. There can be, in essence, an us, whether that us means broad-based labor protections, whether it means universal health care, whether it means a robust public education system, K through university. It's to undermine the notion that we can actually collectively have shared nice things, because we're meant to understand that's impossible because there's a them that just doesn't want to work, a them that is corrupting our children, of them that just isn't teaching their children the right things. And because there's a them that just simply won't do the right thing, we need to just look out for ourselves. And we need to be angry at any kind of collective force, i.e. government, that attempts to create some sort of broad-based social system, whether, like I said, that be healthcare, that be labor protections, that be universal paid family leave, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This kind of messaging breeds economic resentment. The cycle goes on and on and on in turn. Where this has left the left, and sadly, I wish this were no longer the case. I wish that I no longer had to repeat this, but this is the tiredest conversation that just keeps happening. In the Bill Clinton years, we called it triangulation. With the initial rise of Trump, this was about us eschewing, quote unquote, identity politics. In today's parlance, it is called quote unquote popularism. It is the same damn argument every single time. It just gets some sort of surface makeover. And that argument says that the way that the left lost its way, by the way, not just in the United States, this is a debate that is happening in the global north. We see it in Australia, we see it in the UK, we see it across the EU. Where the left has lost its way is that we stop talking about bread and butter issues, wages, working conditions. We just need to talk about economic things that are popular with people. And that is how we will win back voters, because those are things that impact everyone, no matter their race, no matter their gender, gender identity, etc. And then we have folks who remind us that the core of a progressive base, especially in a spot, for example, like Detroit, are Black and brown folks. And if we're not attending to issues of racial justice, of gender, essentially what a functional country would call human rights, but not ours, then our base is left cold. And as we know very well, we frequently have a mobilization, a turnout problem. And so then there are people who have told us we need to do both. And where that ends up is in a very cumbersome, ineffective message that basically sounds like this. It's getting harder and harder to make ends meet, comma, and that affects African Americans in particular. Healthcare is increasingly out of reach, comma, and Latino families are really struggling with it. It's where we name an economic issue. We remember someone told us we were supposed to talk about race, so we shove it over there in a dependent clause. And then when we test that kind of message, what we find is, oh, shocker, it doesn't work. And so the conclusion becomes, we can't talk about race. When actually the conclusion ought to be, we can't talk about race badly, because it turns out if you talk about anything badly, it just kind of doesn't work. And so instead, where we have arrived and have been testing since 2017, 2018, re-upped, refreshed with folks, in fact, in the introduction to this call, in Michigan, among other states, is a narrative that makes race and class, and more recently, as I'll show at the end, gender, inseparable. It is not a race and class narrative. It is, in fact, a race-class narrative. And the core elements of it are insistence upon cross-racial solidarity toward a government that looks like us, reflects us, acts in our interest and name, toward the twin goals of shared prosperity and racial justice, and I would also say gender equality. So I told you before that the winning message architecture is values, villain, vision. That still holds. This is simply a complication of that same thing. So again, what the winning narrative does is it opens with a shared value and it names, or if it's an ad, it depicts or shows race and gender and class. It moves to the problem, the villain, second, and it talks about that villain in a very specific way as trafficking in deliberate division and or scapegoating in order to aid and abet their economic plunder. It makes the connection between the particular harms that are inflicted upon whatever that targeted scapegoated group is, and how this actually, to some degree, screws us all. It then emphasizes unity and collective action to achieve victory, and it connects the act of joining together cross-racial solidarity to achieve the desired outcomes by talking about that vision of that beautiful tomorrow that we want people to hunger for because we want them to act on behalf of it. So what does that sound like in practice? This is an example from recent testing. So this is a race-class narrative applied to the idea of revenue.
No matter our background, faith, or color, most of us work hard for our families. But as our work has made America prosper, a greedy few have rigged the rules to redirect resources from our communities to their country clubs, from our classrooms to their ballrooms, and from our public parks to their private jets. Now they stir fears based on what we look like or where we come from, hoping we will blame everyday people for the hardships these wealthy few create, so we don't join together to demand our shared resources deliver the programs, schools, and supports all of our families need. Together, we can demand our lawmakers rewrite the rules so nothing stands in the way of us providing a great life for our families.
When we have the time and the space, we do the full race-class narrative architecture, but full disclosure, we don't always do it. When we're making 15-second, 30-second ads, we sometimes just hit two of the points, the essential ones, which are, again, that values idea, say what you're for, and then a call out of the villains, explaining not just what they're doing, but ascribing motivation to why. Here's an example of that more compact iteration of RCN applied to public education from a recent round of ad testing.
Things have changed since the 1950s, but some things haven't changed enough. Don't let anyone take us back there. Let's make a better future. Demand accurate, honest, fully funded education for our children.
And another example, this time of the full narrative. Test yourself to see, we'll do a simplified form. You can tell when it is making the value statement, the villain statement, and the vision statement. So values, villain, vision. See if you can tell where those transitions happen.
We want our communities to be healthy and vibrant.
And so we march together
to demand justice.
While a handful of politicians try to make us fear each other,
we're onto them. And we count on us.
And so we turn up.
And we turn out as voters.
To make this a place where liberty and justice are for all.
For all.
For all.
Para todos.
Vote.
And finally, actually not finally, because almost finally, if your words don't spread, they don't work. We need to remember that a message is like a baton that needs to be passed from person to person to person. And if it gets dropped anywhere along the way, it is by definition not persuasive. A message that people don't hear doesn't persuade them. And so what we look for in our messages is that, first of all, they move our base from simple agreement, which our base agrees with everything we say. That's why they're our base. That's how we define them. So that's not an achievement. We need to move them from that agreement to a willingness to repeat in order to achieve that all important echo chamber, that repetition, repetition, repetition. And so the message needs to get that choir, get our base excited, not just to grudgingly agree with it, but be willing to put the t-shirt on, whether literal or metaphorical. And then, of course, as we know, there's not enough of our base to win these arguments, to win these contests, to win these elections. And so we also need to persuade people. In that, we need to remember that we have been fed a false idea of how these swing voters, middle of the road, conflicted, etc. people work. I prefer the term conflicted to moderate, median, whatever, because that is a more accurate representation of the way testing shows they actually come to judgments. These are folks I like to call the good point people, because they're like this: good point, but also good point, but yeah, good point. That is, they are especially susceptible to the arguments and ideas and messages that they hear repeated over and over. That is true to a certain extent for all people, but in particular, people who are not ideological, who do not have cemented fixed views, whether they be about issues or they be, under a partisan umbrella, they toggle between competing views of quote unquote the way the world works, and what they hear repeated most often, what they see in their environment garnering social proof, i.e. what people like me seem to think is what is true and common sense for them. Thus, the reason why it is all the more vital that our choir want to keep singing from that songbook. And then finally, we need to recognize that there is a group of people who cannot, shall not, will never agree with us. And that's our opposition. And if there are people who fundamentally disagree with us at the level of our core values, our policy preferences, everything we believe in and stand for, we want those people to not like what we're saying. Because if those folks like what we're saying, then we need to ask ourselves, what exactly are we saying? Breaking a signal through the noise is incredibly difficult, as I'm sure all of you are aware. It requires an unrelenting, concerted effort of the variety that we made across a set of brand families, including, of course, upper right-hand corner, We Make Michigan. This messaging approach is not just about having that songbook and having that content, some of which I've shared with you. It's also about organizing the choir so that different groups, labor unions, faith-based groups, inside, outside, within a state ecosystem, are all echoing the same message, ideally under a shared brand, so that people keep seeing that and hearing it over and over and over again, whether it's an argument about taxes, it's an argument about wages, it's an argument about water, it's an argument about electricity, it's an argument about public schools. If we keep using the same branding over and over again when different organizations, unions, etc., are making their argument, then that is echoing in people, just like, to take a marketing example, Just Do It echoes for people anytime Nike is trying to sell them any one of their products. This is an example from our friends in Minnesota of utilizing their own 2020 brand. You guys were brand twins in 2020. They did We Make Minnesota, you had We Make Michigan. This is them talking about policing under the statement, Fund Our Lives. These are examples, including, in this case, lower right from Michigan, upper right from Wisconsin, from our pals in Ohio, of activating and utilizing these brands in order to convey these messages. And then most recently, adding the additional layer in response to all of the attacks on trans youth that I'm sure you're very, very aware of, how we weave gender into this as well. So in brand new research that we just conducted, and actually that my colleagues at ASO, Jillian Marcellus and Anthony Torres led up, we looked in through multiple rounds to how we actually also confront this issue. And in the most recent round, the culminating round, what we looked at was a greatest hits of right-wing, horrible, terrible, icky vitriol about CRT, about trans youth, basically kind of their greatest hits of moral panic, and how we directly contend with that. And where we landed is this freedom from boxes message. Freedom is a core value. It's incredibly important. It is one of the anchors that allows us to tie together issues, whether that be, in this case, freedom to learn. As you can see in this message, the freedom for kids to be themselves, the freedom to vote, the freedom for us to decide whether and when we grow our families, freedom to thrive and be able to put food on the table and be home in time to eat it, freedom to walk our streets safely, free from gun violence, et cetera, et cetera. It's what allows us to weave together our issues so that, again, we can keep, in essence, kind of saying the same thing. People are hearing the same thing over and over again. So this is the freedom from boxes message. This messaging guide is on our website, as are all of the resources that we ever create. We always make everything open source. That's a big part of our ethos, and that includes the ads, by the way. This freedom from boxes message we found in our testing moved voters both on trans rights and on quote unquote CRT. And that was true both in terms of being supportive of the kinds of candidates we want people to support and in terms of their view on the issue. We also saw this put into practice recently in neighboring Wisconsin, where in the recent election, there was, as I'm sure there is everywhere, a whole slate of really ugly, awful, contentious school board fights that Fox News, in this case, for example, from Eau Claire, made kind of ground zero in these attacks. And these incumbents held their seats, they won. And here you can see one of these winners, Tim Norton, who's the school board president, saying, whether the school board continues to be a vital source of building up our community where students feel safe and welcome, whether it's a place where students are put into separate boxes. Again, that freedom from boxes message, and not given the services and opportunities that every student deserves. That was part of a larger quote. That's what this election is about. And Norton also saying, and people need to know that these tactics are being used to try to make them afraid, try to tear the fabric of our schools, to try to divide votes and control through fear. The example on the right, actually, from the hometown, the 97% white Long Island hometown of my colleague Anthony, Ari, the person depicted here, won his race again in the face of just all out, unrelenting, race baiting, trans panic from the right wing in Long Island. And he, of course, as you can see from his image, a Black man reigning in this exceptionally white place in Long Island. So I'm going to round out very quickly with principles of mobilization. So the first thing that I want to share is that identity precedes action. It is more efficacious to talk to people about being a voter than simply about voting. So whenever you can get away with it, you want to use the language of, will you be a voter? And get people to say that they will be a voter as opposed to merely voting. Social proof, basically the middle school theory of messaging. People do the thing they think people like them do. So you don't want to fall into the trap of thinking that a message that says, turnout's very low in midterm elections, Latinos really aren't turning out, young people don't seem to be getting registered. When you do that, what we find is that that actually demobilizes people. It doesn't make them feel, oh, that means there's a lot of urgency and I need to go do it. What that transmits is like, it gives people permission to opt out. So all of this messaging that we're surrounded by right now that, oh, people aren't going to turn out, it's not going to be like before, that is a self-fulfilling prophecy. We got to cut that shit out. We need to be saying to people, folks are registering, they're turning out like never before, just like we, showed up in record numbers in 18 and 20, we're going to do more, we're going to do it again. Social pressure, a well-known tactic that can, I will full disclosure tell you, often feel, especially to respondents of color, like kind of creepy big brother. classic textbook old school social pressure that we're not excited about is the mailer that comes to your house that says who you vote for is private, whether or not you vote is a matter of public record. Turns out that actually really works, as weird and creepy as it sounds. We can do social pressure, essentially conveying to our target audiences that, you know, whether or not they voted, people can know about it without doing vote shaming and getting into the creepiness. And so I will round out with 2 examples of ads that adhere to a whole bunch of principles of mobilization. I didn't go through all of them. The first is this notion of identity and making people feel good and included, and like voting is some sort of collective act for the good. And then finally, an ad getting at the cynics, of which there are many, and again, understandably so. And with that, I will stop sharing.
What a great bunch of ads. Just incredible. And you'll see in the chat, everybody's saying, where can I get the ads? Where can I get the ads? And so asocommunications.com, right? They're all there.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. And I've seen Lisa put that URL in the ad in the chat. So are you ready for a few questions?
Yes.
I get to ask the first one. I'm so happy because this has been tormenting me. So MAGA Republicans' main communication strategy seems to be to project all of their crimes onto Democrats and progressives, right? We're the groomers. We commit election fraud. We cause chaos in the streets. We crash the economy. It's all projection, and it's so confusing. So how do we address that relentless projection without repeating their frames, using your strategy?
Yeah. So it is, I mean, to say that it is frustrating is like the understatement of the century, right? So I completely understand that, you know, the human response, the psychological response is basically like,
no, we're not.
Yeah, no, we're not. Like, you're the great, you know, yes, you are. No, we're not. Yes, you are. You know, that kind of sort of sibling discourse.
Exactly.
So let me answer in a particular case so that it is like more tangible. Let's say they've just accused you of, which one do you want it to be? Do you want to say groomer?
Oh, yeah, let's say groomer. That's the current, that's du jour. Let's say groomer.
Okay, so they've just said to me in some way, you know, you're grooming our kids for like sexual deviancy. Yeah. So I call myself, I like recognize that, and this is really important. When you respond to someone, if someone has made that accusation, it's your response is not to them. In the same way as if you're doing a TV hit, a radio hit, the person who is asking the question is a foil. You're actually performing for the audience, because the person who has made that accusation of you, they fall into that third opposition category. They cannot, shall not, will not, you are never changing their mind. Someone who speaks in that way is committed opposition.
Yeah.
So the only reason, I mean, so the first level answer is like, why are you talking to them? Like you should not be talking to them, because there's no persuasion to be gotten there, and you don't want mobilization to be gotten there because you don't want to turn them out. Mm-hmm. However, if they're doing that and you are forced to respond because there is an external audience, first tip, remember the person who just said that to you, that's not the audience. They're a foil. you're actually talking to the people who are listening. That would be the only reason to respond, is if there are third parties. So is this making sense, the setup I'm describing?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So that's happened, for some reason I need to respond because other people can see my response. So what I would say is, it depends whether it's interpersonal. I'm going to say it's like interpersonal, I'm on a talk show or whatever. I would say, I'm a mom. Teresa, do you have kids? Yeah. Or Teresa, did I pronounce it wrong? I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
I mean, I don't know about you, but when I think about being a mom, I think most moms sort of want similar things. We want our kids to grow up and be healthy, to live their dreams, to be able to explore who they are, to not have shoved upon them some sort of identities, to have the freedom to learn the truth of our history and not be walking through a place wondering whether or not they're going to be killed. They want to be safe. Exactly, Veronica. I think that's pretty much what most moms want. But today, there's a handful of people that want our kids to be exposed to bullets and fear books. And they're hoping that if they can spread lies about us and make up stories about who we are and what we believe, we'll look the other way, while they refuse to pass common sense gun safety measures, while they keep taking away the money that our schools need to truly educate our kids. They think we're idiots and that we're going to fall for their lies and tricks, but we know better. Look, I'm a mom. I wasn't born yesterday. And I know that when they're name calling and they're out here making accusations, it's because they've got something to hide. Because they have a track record here in this state of Michigan of decimating our schools and destroying our kids' lives. And if anyone thinks that I'm going to fall for name calling from some idiot schoolyard bully that actually wants to screw over our families, they've got another thing coming. That's off the cuff. So that's what you do.
I'm in awe. I'll never call you a groomer again. I'll never say it again. That's great.
And
That's
remember, in the scenario where you're the evil person who's made that accusation, which would never be you, I'm actually not talking to you. None of that was
right. Right. You're not responding to it. You're saying what you're for. You're starting with what you're for.
Right. Because presumably there's an audience, and that's who I'm actually.
That's who you're talking to.
Yeah.
Awesome. I'm waiting for Brian. Janet, are you next?
Yeah, I'm next. Oh, I'm in the dark again. I'm sorry. So we've been working a lot on getting more aware of and working with our more rural areas. And so what kind of messaging for mobilizing rural voters? A lot of Michigan has a population 90% white, very Republican. And Democrats out there are personally harassed and intimidated. The voices of people of color are silenced actively. So what sort of race class story belongs to rural and white Michigan? And the other part of it is that we can't reach a lot of these people online because they don't have broadband, et cetera. So it's, again, well, as you just said, we're not really talking to the ones who are convinced. We're trying to talk to people who are swayed out there.
Yeah. So again, discipline. We need to remember that there are lots of reasons for communication, but vis-a-vis political communication, strategic communication, there are only two reasons to be communicating. It is either to change what people believe or it's to change what people do. And so first you need to quickly take a measure of the person with whom you are speaking or interacting. And I understand, these are not one-on-ones. So I'm saying that sort of metaphorically. It's not necessarily a one-on-one, it could be all kinds of things. Could be one-on-one, could be an ad, could be whatever. But you need to make sure that the exchange that you're engaged in is either for the purposes of mobilization or persuasion. And if that person is the committed opposition, then again, what are you doing with your time? You're wasting it. Yeah. You are wasting your breath. Go away. Go to a different door. Go get someone else, right? So with that said, what I would say is that the way that we tailor our messages is, if I know that I'm talking to rural folks, in the opening value statement, I always want to do a match to the issue that I'm going to talk about and to the target. So if I'm talking to somebody rural, let's say, because somebody brought it up in the chat, they're really concerned about broadband, or they're really concerned about, give me another example of an issue.
Well, guns out there.
Guns.
The big one. Yeah.
And healthcare. Okay. So if I'm going to do that, I'm going to go in with an opening value, and I'm going to go in with a naming of difference that touches on that. So what that sounds like, again, this is off the cuff, so it needs to be copy edited down. I'm making this up on the spot. But I would say, whether we're, living in the UP or the center of Detroit, whether we're Black or white, young or old, lifelong Michiganders or newcomers, I think most of us want to know that if someone we love is ill or injured, we can take them to a doctor and they'll get care, and we won't get sick ourselves worrying about the bill. But today, a handful of corporations and the politicians they pay for have priced our life and our health out of reach. They're essentially picking and choosing who can have care, and in some cases, who can live and die in order to pad their own wallets. And then they hope that we'll look the other way and start blaming each other, or calling out folks in Detroit, or crying and screaming about immigrants, because they know that if they can divide working people by what we look like or what our zip code, that we won't join together and have the strength in numbers to demand the kind of care every single one of our families need. Look, I've lived all my life up here on this farm, and what I know is that, yeah, I may live differently to somebody who's in the middle of a big city, but my dreams for my kids are the same. My need for healthcare are the same. My desire to be able to open the tap and have the water I drink be safe and the air that I breathe be clean. That's what everybody wants. And when we pick leaders that want to govern for every single one of us, that's what we'll get. So that kind of thing.
Perfect. Perfect. We'll just write it down and clean it up. Excellent. Thank you.
Hey, Anat, how are you? This is Brian. We've heard, and I think a lot of us have heard about and talked about the race class narrative. But for some of us, fundamentally, racism is at the core of everything. Racial disparity is at the core of everything, certainly in America. So there's a concern that with the race class narrative, race doesn't get the kind of focus that it needs to have. Can you speak to that? Speak to, how do we deal with that?
Yeah, it's a great question, a totally valid one, and one I'm not surprised to get. We get it a lot. So I have lots of responses to that. The first is that to some degree, there's a canard about relationships that you can choose to be right or you can choose to be happy. And by happy, in the case of advocacy, I mean win. I mean actually change the material conditions in people's lives and have, electoral, whatever the win is in the particular situation, whether it's an issue, an election, whatever. And so what we see over and over again is that unfortunately we live in such a white supremacist culture. We live in such a racist society, because I agree with you completely. Like, I have no issue with everything that you said. True. That when we simply call things out as racist, we say, that statement was racist, this is racist, that is racist. Unfortunately, people's default understanding of racism is actually more like prejudice. They understand it to be kind of interpersonal beef, where I don't like you because you're XYZ and you don't like me because I'm ABC, and that's what racism is. They lack the fundamental understanding that actually racism is prejudice plus power. And without that power element, that it's structural, it's embedded into the laws that we make, you know, the streets that we live on, where people were, all the things that I don't need to tell you because I know you know. And so if it were to work, if it would be effective to have a message that simply would say, this is racist and that is racist and this is racist, etc., then I'd be so excited about that. Like if that were a valid theory of change, if that actually created either persuasion or mobilization, then I'd be thrilled. But there's absolutely no evidence of that. And in fact, there's the evidence of the reverse. And I want to be clear, it's not just that that is not persuasive, it's actually not mobilizing. It doesn't make respondents of color want to go act, because what it does is, again, unleash that here is everything that is terrible and horrible. I know you suspected, you already knew that, but now I'm going to provide you with additional information about how terrible and horrible things are. And so if the intended response when you say that, let's say to a Black Detroiter, is to get them to go want to vote, that's not what happens. And so the purpose of the race class narrative is to call out race, is to be explicit about race, and is, I would argue, to be explicit about racialized harms, and to do so in a way that actually motivates respondents of color to action and doesn't sort of further exacerbate and fuel the understandable cynicism, and persuades the folks we need to persuade. The last thing that I will say about that is we have a neat, pat sort of binary idea that the base is POC and that the persuadables are white. I wish that were the case. There's a whole shit ton of people of color in the persuadables. Divide and conquer is the oldest trick in the book because it works. And the ability to, for example, divide Black folks from Latinos. I'll just take one simple example. Like, that's real. The susceptibility to these racialized wedges, they don't just work on white people. And that's, I mean, I wish that weren't true, but like the data don't lie.
All right, thanks. Thanks.
Cool. And yes, I'll jump in now with, I think, the last question for this portion of the evening. I think this will hopefully be really top of mind and pertinent for a lot of folks. Curious how we talk about elections and generate enthusiasm without setting people up for the cynicism and hopelessness you talked about when politicians inevitably fall short of our wildest dreams. How do we mobilize people for elections while being honest about the overwhelming importance of outside social movements for actually improving people's lives long term?
Gotta come in and give me the hard ending question. So, I come in one flavor and it's candid, and I'm not gonna start bullshitting you now just because it's, we're nearing the end here, and it's late, especially in your day. We're in a rough spot. Like, it's not pretty. I'm part of a research collaborative. We do 2 to 4 focus groups a week and have been for 2 years. Like, it's not pretty what we hear from our surge voters, Black youth, Latino. Like, we're doing different configurations every single week and have been for 2 weeks. And like, it's not a way to feel good about America. And I'm gonna, try not to say too much more about what's going on because I don't want to depress the hell out of you. People are everything that you know that they are, right? They're upset, they're despondent, they're despairing, they're like, we did turn out for these fuckers, what the fuck did they do for us, right? I'm starting to swear now because like I'm channeling. So I'll tell you what we don't do, because people don't feel this. And some of what I say, I want to put a really fine point on it because I don't want to confuse people with what feels like contradictions. So we don't say to them, Dems delivered, for example, which is a popular hashtag online. And the reason that we don't say that is because it is a losing prospect to try to argue people out of their feelings. You cannot argue people out of their feelings. If they do not feel that they have been delivered to, then you claiming that they have, like all that does is engender a like, what are you talking about? And please say no more things. So what are our choices? Our choices are first, always to do the contrast. Meaning, and I'll give you an example of that, like in a message. And then second, to make voters the hero, to make voters the agent. Because something that we need to remember about voting, and this is very hard for activists to internalize. It's hard for me to internalize because, you know, like we would never miss an election. We would never not vote. Like we are voting, you know, like we love ourselves some voting. We want to be voting all the time. For other people who are not activists, voting is actually not a belief. It's a habituated behavior. Voting is much more like flossing than it is like some sort of ideological endeavor. People who vote, vote. People who don't vote, don't vote. And so the number one thing that actually alters voting behavior, I know this sounds boring and not sexy, is talking about voting. If you want to get people to vote, you got to talk about voting. And that is true more than talking about candidates, more than talking about issues. And so what does all of that sound like together? More or less, it sounds like no matter what we look like or where we come from, most of us value our freedom to vote and pick the leaders who will govern in our name. Freedom for our kids to learn the truth of our past. Freedom to thrive in jobs that pay us fair wages. Freedom to be ourselves and not be put into boxes and make choices over what happens in our own bodies and over our own lives and in our families. But today, Trump Republicans want to take away every single one of our freedoms so they can rule only for the wealthy few. They know that we turned out in record numbers in 2018 and again in 2020, and we took them out. If they think they're going to block our votes and silence our voices, they have another thing coming. We are going to turn out like we never had before until every single leader that is sworn an oath to represent us actually governs in our name. So it's defiance. It's the like, they got another thing coming. We're going to do this and we're going to show up. It's not Dems delivered. It's been so great. Why aren't you happy? Yeah.
Anat, we have a ton of questions in the Q&A, but no time now to go there. So where can people go? A lot of the questions are specific about specific topics. How should I talk about this? How should I talk about that? Yeah. Where can people go to ask those questions? Is the Slack group the best place, or are there other places? And can you give people information about how they can get on that?
Yeah, so the first thing that I would say is check out, like look at ASO, our site, look at We Make the Future. The messaging guides, there are messaging guides about lots and lots and lots of things. So first check there, the answer may already be there. The second, thank you for people putting that in the chat for me, that's awesome. The Slack group, which maybe Eli can say more about, I'm not sure if I can put him on the hook for that. We Make the Future, which is the implementation home, shout out to We Make the Future, for the race class narrative. And among the millions of things that those brilliant, wonderful colleagues do is they have a Slack group for implementers of the race class narrative in different states, including, of course, Michigan. Oh, Anika's here. Oh, good. Anika actually originally a Michigander, defected to Texas. Sorry, I told on you, Anika. And so actually Anika can tell you more about the Slack group, but basically it's a way to be in communication with other people who are implementing the race class narrative in their respective spots. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So we are going to be sending out, just so everybody knows, we're going to send out a follow-up email to everybody that was here today with a link to the video and stuff, and we'll make sure that that information is there too. So
And lots of the work that I shared today, in particular, the education ads, is work. We work all the time with We Make the Future. So that was stuff that we did together. Same with the 2020 implementation. Yeah.
All right. All right. So our next, the next segment, and really the final segment, other than the wrap up, is to talk about some success stories. So if Eli and Jennifer could come off of a video, I will spotlight them, and I will, just a second, get rid of my own, add spotlight. All right, and I will go away. Take it away, folks.
Cool. Thanks, Chris. Hello again, y'all. I'll try to be brief and boil this down a bit, and then I'll pass it to my friend Jim Root. But basically, I wanted to shout out a couple of moments over the past couple of years where race class narrative has been really decisive for helping us tell a more compelling story about Michigan, about our past, present, and future, and the kind of world we deserve. So for a couple of things to know about Michigan first, which many of you who are Michiganders will know, is that we got a really viciously segregated state here. And when you add the devastating impact of allowing corporations to raid our communities, bounce, and leave us with the wreckage, you've got really fertile ground for classic divide and conquer politics. So over the past couple of years, race class narrative has helped us redraw the lines of conflict in a way that is persuasive for people by inserting a clear, compelling, and positive story about the Michigan that we deserve and that our communities need. And it's exactly the mobilizing tool we needed in March 2020 when COVID started rampaging across our communities. So Michigan, like a lot of places, was frightened and paranoid about what it meant for people's well-being. And really early on, a bunch of us who are organizers and activists and advocates spotted that the state's right wing was coalescing behind a pretty vicious narrative about my hometown, Detroit. COVID was smashing its way through Detroit, this story went, but that didn't mean the rest of the state should be punished with mask or distancing or shut down mandates. Detroit was a basket case. It needed to be saran wrapped, and the rest of us would be able to get on with our lives afterwards. Before it could really take root, though, we knew we needed to present an alternative story for people to this cutthroat, everyone for themselves worldview. And our story was one where everyday Michiganders could join an ecosystem of care and solidarity, where we could counter the right's cruelty by saying we won't be divided by phony populists who want to throw poor Black and brown communities off a cliff. And we would also lay down the groundwork and lay out the policy package we needed to survive and really flourish. We were lucky that there were a bunch of scripts and a bunch of messaging guides developed by We Make the Future to help us articulate that vision and to help us combat that right-wing narrative. We also, very early in the pandemic, maybe something we can send around after with the package that comes, we wrote a script using race class narrative, and we had Michiganders from a bunch of corners of the state record slices of it, and we stitched it all together and a really powerful video that got a lot of traffic and went a long way towards helping us establish some of the networks of care that would be used throughout the pandemic. But also, that mapped onto what became the local action councils that we launched in November and December of 2020, and then in January 2021, when we needed to hit the streets, when states across the country needed to mobilize in vast numbers to hit the streets as a unified choir that voters had decided, and now it was time for the administration we elected to deliver on the promises that they had made to us. That was a bunch of, again, both organizing work, but also narrative work layered on top of it to talk about what our values were, who the villains were that stood in the way of us having nice things, and how we could achieve those nice things together. Race class narrative in both of those instances was the thread, it was the through line for telling the story that organizers were articulating on the ground. And so I wanted to shout that out. I wanted to shout out how pivotal having a narrative tool like this was in those moments of very immediate and severe crisis. And with that, I'll bounce it to Jim Root, a friend who is also a part of We Make Michigan, which I'll share links to. It's our narrative hub. It's where we do race class narrative here in the state. Jen is the executive director of SEIU Michigan, and we'll just say a bit about how SEIU has started to weave in some race class narrative there.
Thanks, Eli. As he said, I'm with SEIU Michigan, the Service Employees International Union. We represent about 35,000 workers all across Michigan in incredibly diverse set of professions, from custodians to unemployment insurance agents to corrections officers to the people who paint the Mackinac Bridge, wide array of workers. And what I will say is, so we were early in the race class narrative work, and we've definitely incorporated it into our external and internal communications with respect to politics, media releases, all of those things. But what I wanted to highlight was also that We Make Michigan, and Eli specifically, and some of the other teammates that he works with, do really great trainings for workers, for community members that are just really powerful. A few months back, Eli came to what we call our Worker Leadership Academy, which is a space where we bring together union and not yet union workers from all across the state and all types of industries. Again, all the diversity I just mentioned, we have workers from all of those spaces in one space to build solidarity together. And often race and class are used to divide even within our labor movement, right? Which workers deserve healthcare, which workers deserve a pension, and that kind of thing. So this was a really powerful tool to be in that space. And Eli, it was about a 2-hour training, and it was just incredibly powerful. We had one of our members, I have a couple examples, but one of our members who works in a city that I won't name, but we have city workers and school workers in the same city, right? And at the school district, we have mostly what are called parapros. They work in schools to help children who have special needs or need additional help. They are overwhelmingly Black women. And then at the city, in that same community, we have workers who work for various city departments. They wear shirts and ties to work, and they're for the most part older white men. And one of our members articulated to us this kind of divide and this lack of solidarity. They're in the same union, in the same city, both struggling to make ends meet in different ways, both struggling with a lot of the same struggles. And so this lack of unity. And one of our members, Ms. Carmela, took the race class narrative training into that space to help build that solidarity. And now they are, doing joint pickets together around some of the issues they're having. And it just gave her the language and the tools to really bridge a divide that's existed within her own union and very close to home. And then we had a member, Derek, who does canvassing for us in our IE universe, which I won't describe for other reasons, but he took a race class narrative training, a different training, but a race class narrative training, and suddenly, like, the number of actual conversations he had with voters doubled in the span of 2 weeks, and his refusal rate went to almost 0, because he was approaching conversations in a different way, with a different level of script adherence and a different set of tools. And so I just wanted to highlight that these tools that race class narrative provides can be useful in a number of contexts, and it's just a really powerful way of thinking, and it's been impactful for our workers for sure.
Thank you so much for that. It's important for us to see, I think, that this stuff is more than just a lot of good ideas. It can be implemented in a way that is super effective. Okay, so I'm gonna give me just a moment here. All right, so again, we want everybody that's on this call and everybody around us that we can teach about this stuff to take this information that you learned today. And one of the things that Anat says is that repetition is so important, and that goes for implementing RCN as well. I find myself having to return to watch some of these videos periodically just to remind myself and to make sure I'm thinking about it and then I'm practicing it. And that repetition is really important. We're going to, I just want to thank Anat so much for joining us today. It was just such a joy and such an honor to have her here. We will continue to watch the work that you do, as well as the organizations that are implementing your work, and put it to work. Thanks to Eli and Jennifer for sharing their stories. Thanks to our team members, Lisa Dorado, Michelle Pallas, and Brian Watson from the Liberal Leadership League. And then Teresa Reed and Janet Cannon from the Washtenaw County Democratic Party, as well as Eli again from We Make the Future. Thanks so much to all of our promotional partners. The fact that we had for the last time I looked, it was 200 and some people on here. That's all due to the efforts that our promotional partners made to promote the event, and it's so important. Just as a reminder, I've said this before in the chat and on the video, but this has been recorded. We will be producing this into a YouTube video. In a few days, you'll get a follow-up email And so will all the people that registered, even those that didn't attend. That has the links to the video. We'll do a transcript of the chat in case you want to go back there and pull out some of these great links that people have been putting in there. And we'll have some other resources as well. If you do have, I know we didn't get to a lot of the questions, and that's that's just the nature of the beast with this kind of event. But we will put information in there on how to get onto that Slack channel where you can ask people who are implementing this stuff and working with this stuff every day specific questions about specific things that you need help communicating with. And I find that to be a helpful thing, because a lot of times people have questions that I didn't even consider. And so I find it very, very educational. There's an event coming up that I wanted to tell you about. It's called Campaign Fundamentals with Shelley. It's on July 7th from 7 p.m. Eastern time. Shelley Cohen will present best practices in messaging. We're talking with voters at the doors, on the phone, and across the kitchen table. And by showing successes from 2020, she'll demonstrate what works on flyers, billboards, and in social media. So don't miss it. You can register now. I think somebody's putting, yes, there it is. Lisa has put the link in the chat. So thank you for sticking with us this long. I have a very short survey that I'd like to launch, and if you could just take a moment and answer 2 quick questions, we'd appreciate it. This this is the second of these types of events that we've done, and the information that we get back helps us make the next one even better. So we appreciate all of the lauding accolades in the chat. It's been very gratifying. This literally has been organizing process for probably about 2 months. So so with that, I'm going to say goodbye to everybody, and we will I'll leave the survey open for a bit so that everybody can take a chance to answer that. So thanks, everybody.